Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 92 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended lifeforms are so amazingly primitive that two of them still think doing a podcast called Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea is a pretty neat idea. These podcasters have, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Actually, this is the solution. Hey Bryan, what's this?
Well, Jeff, this is our discussion of Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency by Douglas Adams.
His straightforward novel about the Earth's potential destruction and the end of mankind.
Well, we don't find that out till the end.
No.
You're jumping all the way to the end. Oh, man.
Yes.
I'm so excited. I don't know if you are, but, well, for us, April is the beginning of convention time.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm 2 weeks out from my first convention of the year. Have you been to one of these this year so far?
I have not.
Oh, and then we get together at the end of the month.
Yeah, the ones out here are August for me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's right. So it's going to be an exciting month, and I think it's going to take us a month to get through this book. So
I think it will.
Oh my goodness. Unlike so many others of the stories that we've read and information that we've gone through, this particular one, I have a ton of notes. And I think you'd be better sit back, relax, and start talking.
Yes. I've read this book a number of times. And the first time I read it, I got lost in the middle somewhere. And by the end, I had no idea what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so lost that I thought, if I go to the library and read Rime of an Ancient Mariner, it'll all fall into place. Well, it didn't.
No, it didn't.
And then the next time I read it, I got further before being lost, and I got further the next time. There are so many similar parallel things happening at the same time that if you get distracted and your mind drifts at the wrong point, they cross, and then it really gets muddled up, and it certainly did for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have not read this story that many times. In fact, I think we've talked about this before. Generally speaking, if I read a book, I've never reread one. Not until we started doing this podcast, and now I've reread many books.
Yes.
This one in particular really requires a reread.
Yes.
Or if you're listening to this podcast, I think we are both about to give you some good advice. What do you think?
I think so. Yeah, the first time I read this, I read it like a hitchhiker's novel, where you don't have to really pay that close attention to enjoy and understand it.
Yes.
And then having mentioned hitchhikers, I do want to mention that there are a lot of similar things between the two books.
Oh, yes. And don't worry, I've made note of every one of them.
All right. A few of them might be coincidences, but the sheer magnitude of them is staggering. So in my summary, I will try and slide in every hitchhiker's reference that I found. I'm not going to point them out. You can point them out, or the listener can play the game of see if I can spot the hitchhiker reference. But they're pretty blatant.
Oh, yeah. There's quite a few. And the other thing that you and I will agree on is, again, Douglas Adams is so intelligent. And remember, we were talking about Last Chance to See and then A Salmon of Doubt, and we were talking about his friends. And the anthropologist that he worked with became a fan of Douglas Adams from reading this particular book. And I was curious about that and wondered at great detail why this book would be so appealing to him, where you and I might consider it one of his offhand second piece books.
Right.
but the intricacy of this plot line is such that
Yeah.
it's very complicated. And one of the key pieces, again, goes back to 19th century literature.
Right.
Which doesn't sound that far ago.
Early 19th century.
Early 19th century literature. And in fact, the Kubla Khan poem and its origin is important in this story.
Right. This book is dedicated to his mother, and he adds, who liked the bit about the horse. When I read it the first time, I had no involvement with horses whatsoever, but I found it fascinating that there could be a part about a horse that would be interesting. It's like, what about a horse could be in there that his mother would point out and say, wow, I really like that.
Well, there's a whole chapter about what horses think.
Yeah, so I couldn't believe that there would be a bit about a horse that was memorable, and there is, and we have that printed out and laminated and attached to our barn wall right now because it is so perfect.
Yes, I do recall.
Yeah. And that is followed by an author's note, which basically says that St. Ced's College in the book is an amalgam of many different colleges, and it is not meant to represent any specific college. So
okay, well,
don't sue
sense.
me.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so we're going to start out with Chapter 1.
Good place to start.
And I think if you get a bunch of book lovers together, a conversation will usually arise about who's got the best opening line of a novel or what's your favorite opening line of a novel. And I think this one tops my list.
Oh, yeah.
So the opening line of this is, this time there would be no witnesses. I don't know. It just, it makes you want to know what's happening.
Well, you know, it's a detective novel. You know, you got to figure something like that. Intrigue.
So it says that there's a dark, tilted tower on a desolate volcanic planet, and there appeared to be a being carrying a lantern that exited the tower and walked once around it. It re-entered the tower, and then, after some time, there was an apparent explosion. Chapter 2.
Yes, quite mysterious and quite confusing already. But you know what I did think was interesting? Right off the bat, you've got your first reference to The Hitchhiker's Guide. And that's the description of the rain and the different rain that is falling upon the character in the story.
Oh, that's right, yes.
So
Right.
he's reminiscent of the rain god right off the start.
Yes. And we learn of the electric monk who is seated atop a bored horse. And the electric monk is a device that believed things for you. This way you were not burdened by having to believe all the things the world expected you to believe. So this book was written in 1987, and I cannot believe that this technology has not been invented and integrated into our society at this point.
Well, maybe it has.
Yeah.
We just don't recognize it.
Yeah. And this is another thing that makes me wonder what Douglas would have to say about the world today.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought we should design an app.
Yes, and we did.
And we did. So I did search Electric Monk app, and I found two.
Oh, really?
The first is an app that was last updated 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to install it, but my phone said it was for an older version of Android and rejected it.
Uh-huh.
And it didn't really say what it did, but a screenshot showed that it just had a list of things that the monk believed and seemed to be taken out of the book, like everything is pink.
Right.
And then I found another one. And this one was kind of insulting because this one was supposed to be inspired by Philip K. Dick.
Okay.
And it was called The Electric Monk.
Mm-hmm.
And it was powered by ChatGPT. And I guess ChatGPT is the way it should be, but ours won't be nearly that complicated. So this Electric Monk was faulty, and believed odd and strange things. Like I mentioned, currently that everything is pink. And the horse was perfectly normal, and horses have always understood a great deal more than they let on. And now is my favorite quote, and it was the truest thing ever said. Here we go. It is difficult to be sat on all day, every day, by some other creature without forming an opinion about them. On the other hand, it is perfectly possible to sit all day, every day, on top of another creature and not have the slightest thought about them whatsoever.
Perfect.
That was beautiful.
Oh my gosh. And if I could harken back for just a second, one of the other things that we've always appreciated most about Douglas Adams' writing is the way he uses the atmosphere and way he describes it. And just prior to his talking about the horse, he talks about the atmosphere of the planet.
Okay.
And he says, there was a horrible pinkness, a sudden greenness, and a lingering orangeness. And it's just the vivid images with literally 6 words. It's just really impressive.
Yes. So this faulty monk was brought in for repair, and it was found that it would cost more to fix it than it would be to buy the newer, better, upgraded model. So the monk was set free with his horse and turned out into the desert. So again, that's another little jab at technology, and it's still true to this day that everything's disposable.
Right. And he does have a reference in this chapter to the restaurant at the end of the universe, in which he states that this monk was able to believe 16 entirely different things impossible to believe at the same time.
Yeah. So we get to chapter 3, and we are introduced to Susan Way. She is being stood up for a date, and it's not the first time this has happened. So she called another man who has been asking her out and who she's been putting off. And they were going to meet at a restaurant. And by the way, it's Thursday.
You love that? Of course it's Thursday.
And then chapter 4, we get the description of St. Sed's in Cambridge. And there is a special dinner happening. And 2 men are walking to the dinner, a younger man and an older man. The younger man, Richard, kind of tall and lanky. The older man was the Regius Professor of Chronology, or Reg. And he moved like a number of elderly squirrels trying to escape from a sack.
I love the squirrels. They're
squirrels,
back. They're
back. They're back. And he also had the vice of childish conjuring tricks.
Mm-hmm.
The college dinner was candlelit, and I liked Reg's observation of how the quality of the food varies inversely with the brightness of the lighting. And that sounded good until we are told that the meal was awful.
Right.
So I guess that correlation really isn't true, or how bad would the food be there?
Or it was too light in that place.
Yeah. Too many candles.
Mm-hmm.
We learned that Richard is a computer programmer and described computer programming to teaching a dim-witted pupil. He also plays keyboard in a rock group. He also works for Way Forward Technologies, a company owned by Gordon Way. He created business software that could turn corporate financial statements into music. His new passion is to turn things found in nature, like the movement of a bird in flight, and convert that motion to music. But it's not working out well. I find this a whole fascinating aspect of a project that I believe Douglas Adams would have tackled himself.
Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about that.
So at this dinner, there's a gentleman who was forced to bring his little daughter with him because there was no babysitter. And her family have recently returned from a trip to Greece. And she insisted on bringing a pot she found in the harbor to the dinner to find out if it was valuable. And everybody kind of took a look at it, and then finally one person who was kind of an archaeologist revealed that it was common and not valuable at all. So Reg did one of his childish conjuring tricks with a salt cellar and a hat, which he fetched from another room, and he put the salt cellar in the hat and passed it to the girl. It was gone when she got the hat and asked where it was. She was told it was where she put it. He also said that she was a master conjurer. He took the Grecian pot and wrapped it on the table, splitting it in half. And on the inside of the old pot was the salt cellar, and nobody was impressed.
Yeah, and it's funny because obviously we're going to get back around to the old salt cellar, but they do describe it as having small bits of rust on it and things of that nature, which I thought was rather interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a couple other things in this particular chapter which I thought were fascinating. Again, relating to Douglas's writing, it's a joy to read, but he does a sequence with Reg where Reg is taking off his overcoat and his scarf.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a rhythmic read. It's just amazing. And of course, this is the Doctor of Chronosis, which of course we will learn more later. But chronosis would be a derivation of chronology or time.
Yes.
They describe him, Reg, as having his memory almost completely extinct.
Right.
Oh, and it's just amazing.
So another thing that he does right at the very end of this chapter, which reminded me of something we talked about when I think it was the first radio series, maybe it was the second radio series. I don't remember which one, but there's the character Rooster.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, Rooster gets brought up very early in this conversation. Like, why did you talk about Rooster? And it was just because he was going to be introduced later and you needed to know he was an old friend. Well, here, out of the blue, Reg just asks Richard about his friend Svlad Chaley, who has changed his name to Dirk Gently. And like, what? Why did you just bring up Svlad Chaley?
Yeah, and the other thing that we don't learn about until much, much later in the book is that the appointment of this position that Reg holds as a Regis was created by King George III for this college.
Yes.
And he is the chair of chronology. And King George apparently asked him 3 questions that the chair was designed to answer.
Mm-hmm.
And here we learned 2 of the questions.
Right.
And we learned the answers to all 3 of the questions.
Right.
One of the questions was there any reason why one thing happened after another thing?
Right.
And another question was, and if there was a way, could it be stopped? And we learned that the 3 answers are yes, no, and maybe.
Right.
And of course, this is King George III. He's the crazy king. And this is for our English audience, which some of us are. King George III was known as the crazy king. He was a king from 1760 until 1820.
Okay. And that whole passage reminded me of, and it really comes straight out of his everything that happens happens.
Exactly.
Everything in happening that causes something else to happen causes something else to happen. So it's it's that theme again, just repackaged here for Dirk.
Oh, absolutely. And that's, I think, one of the key features of his writing. He never lets a good idea go to waste.
No, he doesn't.
And he wrings the neck of some of these good ideas.
Yeah, he squeezes every last drop.
But it's in the packaging that we are amazed,
Yes.
Because if we had read this book first, I wonder what our thoughts would have been like,
Right. So chapter 5, we're back with the monk on his horse, and he's high on a rocky promontory, and he's starting to have doubt. And he's not used to it, and it's unsettling. But it passed. And then he started to believe. And his belief grew, and he believed that a door would open to a new and mysterious land. So the monk went to where he thought the door would be, prepared for disappointment, but the door was there. A white wooden door with a brass knob, and he and his horse entered it. A few minutes later, a figure who had been out of sight rubbed dust on his face, stretched, stood up, patted his clothes, and went for the door. That last line is
This
so
early in the book.
far
Confusing.
removed from when you learn what happens that there is no way, unless you are making notes, that you would know that they are related.
Right. And it's interesting here because, of course, you did mention it, but I'll reinforce it here. The electric monk believes that everything he sees is pink.
Yes.
And everything around him is pink.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, when he gets down to around where the doorway is, he actually finds an area of pink dust that confirms his thoughts about the color that surrounds him.
Yes.
Again, vital information that doesn't
Yes.
seem to be important in any way, shape, form,
here-
or fashion.
But there's no way you could retain this information till the end of the book. So we get to chapter 6, and we are back at the Coleridge dinner where they are reading one of Coleridge's poems. Richard starts thinking of Dirk, and we get a description. Rounder than average, and seemed to always wear a dark red round hat with a flat brim that appeared to always stay level regardless of how Dirk moved. He was from Transylvania, apparently inherited psychic powers from his grandmother. He wore a large flappy leather coat and liked to hang upside down on one of those devices to cure your bad back, because when people saw him, it perpetuated the myth that he was a psychic, mystic, telepathic, fey, clairvoyant, psychoasic, a word Dirk invented, vampire bat.
All of which he denied vehemently.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
So Dirk made money in college because he would talk in his sleep after getting drunk, and he would talk about exam questions. And he denied it was true. And trying to prove it was not true, he, under hypnosis, predicted the exams. And the results were sealed in an envelope until after the exams, and he got every question perfectly correct to the last comma. Mm-hmm. So he went to jail.
Right, and of course he made money by selling sneak peeks at the material that he had written, even though he promised not to open it until after the exam.
Correct. Hence why he went to jail.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. At the Coleridge dinner, one of their traditions is to read Kubla Khan in its entirety to the people that are there. So I thought maybe I would read just the first part of the stanza for you.
Well, I think we have to.
In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers, were girded round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests, ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery.
So in chapter 7, we are introduced to Gordon Way, brother of Susan, and head of Way Forward Technologies 2.
Two questions. When they talk about, and this is back in the last chapter, I'm sorry, I flipped the page and realized I had another note. When they talk about Malibu, are they talking about California?
They must have, I don't know of any other Malibu.
Remember he says that he has to, the doctor that his mother has to go to is in Malibu?
So yeah, it must be California. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, one of the things I thought was funny is that they talk about when Dirk is picked up by the police in a black Mariah.
Yes, yeah.
I always thought that was funny. Of course, that's the English version of an American cop car.
Right.
And I just love the phrase Black Mariah.
Mm-hmm. Gordon is in his car and listening to Ravel's Bolero. He mentioned the stereo was so good you could sense the whole ice rink. This is obviously a nod to Torval and Dean's 1984 Olympic gold medal performance, which spawned the new rule that you are no longer allowed to pretend to die on the ice at the end of your performance. So you know there is a groundbreaking performance if they create a rule against what you did. So Gordon went to a filling station, he bought some maps, and then he went back to his car and noticed that the trunk lid was ajar, so he closed it. Gordon called his sister Susan's answering machine because he liked to dictate into them all of the business he has on his mind at the time, because he doesn't like talking to a tape recorder, and an answering machine makes it feel like he's talking to somebody. So Gordon pauses his message, and he puts the phone down because he heard a noise and thought that the trunk lid came loose again. So he stopped to close it. When he walked to the back of the car, the trunk opened, and he was shot dead in the chest with a double-barrel shotgun. It's like, what? Okay.
One of the funniest parts about Chapter 7, I thought, is after Gordon Way gets shot, we pan over to another series where a police officer is doing some interviews of the folks in the area. And he stops at a convenience store, and he talks to one of the convenience store people and shows him a picture of Gordon Way and says,
Right.
Has this man been here? And it's a pretty funny interaction where he says, well, I'm not really sure because that guy never closed his mouth.
Right.
So the police officer continues to interrogate the gentleman at the store. And the gentleman says to him, well, it's a very ordinary night. Nothing crazy or outrageous happened. And in response to that, the cop starts making faces. He sticks his fingers in his ears and sticks his tongue out and flips his fingers back and forth. And then he asks the gentleman, well, how about that? He said, well, that was pretty crazy. He said, well, I just wanted to make sure I had a baseline of what you think is crazy.
Yeah, because that could be a normal night.
Yeah, this is funny because this is a little foreshadowing of that one. That scene shows up way later in the book again.
Yes.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. So we're now back at Reg's set of rooms at the college, and there's a double set of doors to get in. The outer door is a sturdy gray painted oak. The inner door is a simple white panel door with a brass knob. Another white door with a brass knob. The room was decorated like a dark, rich man cave, and there was also a decanter of port and 3 glasses. Out of the blue again, Reg starts a conversation about sofas. So here we get to learn that Richard had a sofa delivered to his apartment, and it is stuck on his stairway. And he has a computer trying to discover the moves needed to get it unstuck. And Friends did a very similar episode where all Ross kept yelling was, pivot, pivot, pivot.
Oh my gosh.
If you ask anybody about a couch stuck in the stairway, they will bring up the Friends episode. But this is where it originated.
Yes, and what's funny about the whole computer discussion, of course, is they break it down into previous discussion that they have about the abacus and how it's such a simple device, and you have to break down every single solitary function to its smallest level so that you can work backwards in reasoning to come up with an answer. Of course, Richard has all of his computers in his house are trying to puzzle out how this sofa got stuck, and of course we don't find out the answer until chapter 35.
Right. So Richard mentions his girlfriend, Susan Way, who is a cellist. What do you know?
Another cellist. A good idea.
Yeah.
Nothing left behind.
So he's really got a thing for cellists, I think, Douglas Adams.
He has a definite thing for cello music. I know that.
Yes. So Richard is telling Reg about a computer program he created. It is not one to help you reach the correct decision. It is one that you put the decision you want into it, and it gives you all the logical sounding reasons to do it. The program was never released because it was bought by the Pentagon.
Right. And don't you love this one?
Yeah.
Only us old people would get a kick out of it, but of course it goes to his favorite person to pick on, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Because he says that it's evident that Ronald Reagan and the Star Wars program now has his software, and that's how they're using his backward reasoning to make sense of what they're actually doing.
Yes.
But backward reasoning, where do we hear that one?
We heard it in Hitchhikers with temporal reverse engineering. So Richard is looking around the room and he finds a book of the Greek Isles and a note inside it that reads, "Regard the simple salt cellar, regard the simple hat." And these were the words Reg used at the dinner when he was entertaining the little girl with a magic trick.
Mm-hmm.
Reg came out of the kitchen with tea, heard a noise upstairs, and dropped it. Richard poured him a glass of port. He heard the noise upstairs again and dropped the port and broke a glass. He spoke ominously about going up to check it, and he told Richard to wrestle him to the ground when he came back if he seemed strange and not himself. Reg went up slowly to check on the noise, and when he came down, he said everything was all right and it was just a horse in the bathroom. And Richard tackled him. That was brilliant.
Just a horse in the bathroom.
Yeah. So Richard did not believe that there was a horse in the bathroom, so he went up to see for himself, and the horse was there. The window was open slightly, but there was no way the horse got in that way. It seems to have been pushed up the stairs. Richard decided he needed some port too, after all, and poured himself some. Reg commented on it being fortunate he put 3 glasses since Richard said he was bringing a friend. And that is when Richard learned that he forgot about Susan, and he is the one that stood her up for the night, and he asked to use the phone.
Oh my gosh, the phone plays such a critical role in all this, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Chapter 9.
This chapter is all about Gordon Way coming to terms with being dead. He can touch and bump things sometimes, but he really can't manipulate anything. Eventually, he realized that he could produce a soft, hoarse noise and that the phone is still connected to Susan's answering machine. So he leaves a brief message. Then he accidentally disconnects the call and cannot operate the phone to reconnect with anybody.
I did think this was funny because it surprises me after all the reading that we've done. I guess surprise isn't quite the right term, but the use of a ghost here, and this is not the only ghost he has in the story.
Which makes it confusing.
Yeah, exactly. It's quite different. After having read Salmon of Doubt and understanding his position on God and his position on death and things of that nature, it surprises me that he uses a ghost in his story.
Right. So Gordon goes to take one last look at his body at the back of the car, and the body is gone. Chapter 10. Richard leaves Reg's rooms and tries to figure out where on the campus the horse could have come from. So he talked to a porter, Bill, though Richard called him Bob, and the porter was no help, so Richard left. The porter talked to another porter about how strange people were. Some guy just asked him about a horse. The other porter had a similar experience with a foreign priest who told him he left a horse in a bathroom. The monk stuck around by a fire for a while, and then the porter told him to shoot off. So the monk, having been told what to do, went to do it.
And by the way, that's literal.
I am... You talk about how intelligent Douglas Adams is, and he does all of these references and reworking of early 19th century literature, but this is really a stretch. What happens with the monk climbing into a trunk that happened to have a shotgun to just shoot some guy because the porter said shoot off.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense.
I always assumed that the monk had a shotgun already. I didn't assume that he found one in the trunk.
Gordon always carries his shotgun. He's a hunter, and people are always asking to shoot his birds.
Oh, right.
So he had his shotgun in the trunk.
Mm-hmm.
Just so happens. It's like, how'd the monk get in the trunk? I mean, he just believed himself in it, I guess.
Well, it's the second ghost that we haven't brought up yet. The monk is currently being possessed by the second ghost.
Oh, okay. All right. So
all of the monk's actions, including the monk's doubt, are a result of his possession. The monk is a functionary designed and built by the ghost's race.
Yes.
Living on the ghost's home planet.
Yes.
Where the pink sand is.
Right.
So his doubt and his actions are a function of the ghost up into and through the shooting away.
Okay.
And beyond, actually.
Okay.
Until he possesses someone else.
Right.
Again, one of the funny things I thought was in chapter 10. Before Richard leaves the building, he goes across the hall, knocks on the door, and tries to interrogate a professor across the hall. And this professor had been introduced before as being one of these people that everybody tried to avoid.
Right.
Because they were nervous. And I just thought it was funny. The only thing the guy says to him is how many days, years, and months it's been since someone actually spoke to him.
Right,
He closes the door.
Because he's the guy with the weird nose.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I just got the biggest kick out of that.
So chapter 11, with nothing else left that he could do, Gordon Way started to walk home. And he was disappointed that he had to walk. He really hoped he would be able to drift. He really wanted to drift. But he decided to try hitchhiking, but was unable to get a car to stop.
Oh, gosh. The only thing I kept thinking about are the hitchhiking ghosts in Disney World.
Oh, right. Yes. So in chapter 12, Richard is driving home frantically, trying to call Susan on his car phone at the same time. And he got turned around and lost. And during this bit, he apparently saw the monk lugging Gordon's body into a field. And he decided to believe it was a farmer carrying a sack.
Mm-hmm.
And during his frantic and apologetic message telling Susan that they would go away for the weekend, all of a sudden he saw the ghost of Gordon Way jump in front of his car. And he slammed on the brakes and swerved and spun the car around, headlights pointed straight at Gordon, who slowly faded away. A police car pulled up and asked him why he was stopped in the road facing the wrong direction. And he asked him if he'd been drinking. Richard goes home, climbs over the sofa in the stairwell, and into his apartment. There he has many computers, one working on the sofa problem, and 6 are working to convert a naturally occurring phenomena into music. And he has not made it work yet. He realized how much work he had to do this weekend and how impossible it was to get away like he promised Susan, but the message was on her machine and there was nothing he could do about it. And then he had an odd thought. So here, obviously, is where the ghost jumped from the monk to Richard.
Right.
Okay. Now, chapter 13 is seems like a non sequitur.
Mm-hmm.
There is a person scanning the city with binoculars from his apartment window, and he settles his gaze on a strange man climbing up a nearby apartment building on the drain pipe and going in one of the 3rd floor windows. The gazer then picks up a phone and dials. And that's pretty much chapter 13.
Oh, yeah.
So, 14 is inside Susan's apartment. After climbing through the window, Richard goes over to the answering machine and is deciding what to do. The phone rings and he reflexively answers it. It is Dirk Gently chastising him for being such a poor burglar. And after a short conversation, Dirk told him to meet him at a pizza place and they hung up. Richard had originally replaced the tape with a blank one, but changed his mind at the last minute and swapped it back as he heard the key in the door. Michael Wenton Weeks walked in ahead of Susan. He was her date for the night. Susan walked over to Richard and slapped him.
I love the way he describes Michael Wenton Weeks as soft, squidgy, and cow-like.
Right. So Michael left, and during the cab ride home, he thought about his editorship of Fathom magazine and how his father spoiled him with it and his mother took it away from him after his father's death.
Right. And in chapter 14, as you've said, this is where we actually learn that the guy with the binoculars is Dirk.
Yes.
Watching Richard scale the wall there.
Right.
And I do love the line. Richard was talking to Susan, and he says to her, in an apologetic way, describing the evening, he says, "There was a horse in the bathroom, and I know how you hate that."
Right. So in chapter 15, the ghost of Gordon Way made it back to the 7-bedroom old rectory that he purchased and called a cottage. He didn't want to have to walk through anything to get into his own house, so lucky for him, the door was left slightly open. Lights were on and there was a fire in the fireplace. He did have the ability to interact with things as his body faded in and out. He tried to see how many things he could interact with. One of the things that he was able to do was turn on the gas of the kitchen stove, but he was not able to light it. Right after his actual missing body fell out of a cupboard, his house exploded. In chapter 16, it's the next morning, and Richard is feeling bad and wanted to make it up to Susan. So he wanted to make dinner reservations at a restaurant he heard about from Gordon. When he called, he was informed that reservations had to be made 3 weeks in advance, so he thought they'd have to go out for pizza. This made him think back on the previous day and thought of Dirk. He found his ad in the Yellow Pages and set off for Dirk's office. When he got there, he heard 2 different arguments, one from the French teacher in Dirk's building and one between Dirk and his secretary, who just quit and stormed out. We learned that Dirk's holistic detective agency refers to his conviction of the interconnectedness of all things. He does not concern himself with petty things like fingerprint powder, telltale pieces of pocket fluff, and inane footprints. With his secretary gone, Dirk has to answer the phones himself, and we hear many discussions with his clients.
And most of them deal with cats.
Yes. And I really like this line because one of these calls, it was said that his expenses are expensive. And Dirk said, of course they were. It's kind of in the nature of the name. So after the calls, Dirk and Richard talk a while about quantum physics and how it relates to Dirk's business. They talk about Schrodinger's cat. And I find it ironic that this thought experiment, which is probably the most widely known piece of quantum physics, was created to demonstrate the problems with some of the theories of quantum physics, not explain them.
Exactly. Amazing, isn't it?
Yes. So Dirk then explains to Richard that he is wanted for questioning by the police for the murder of Gordon Way and explains his fee structure. And you had mentioned Schrodinger's cat, of course, and what I like about that is the description of it is the act of measurement collapsing the waveform. Right. And that's really what this book is really about. It's amazing. I guess as a point of reference, I wanted to point out that at this point, Richard doesn't realize that Way is dead. Right. That, in fact, as it turns out, he is the one who would inherit the Way Forward company should something happen to Way himself. Yes. So that's why he's prime suspect number 1. Exactly. Chapter 17. The electric monk is feeling rather depressed. In fact, he misses his horse and doesn't know where it is. He is still trying to find something to believe. He is also contemplating and reevaluating most of the decisions he has made the previous night. Like shooting off the first person he came across because of the unexpected expression on the person's face after being shot. Also, climbing into the tree he is now stuck in.
Mm-hmm. Now, didn't this bring up all that ogla nut theory?
Yes. Yeah.
The tree will provide, he says.
Yeah.
And it did provide. It provided twigs.
Yes.
Oh, that's so funny. And of course, this is where we learn that the electric monk carries Way's body to his house.
Yeah, so here in this chapter, they do a lot of backtracking. So Richard saw the farmer carrying a sack. That was the monk carrying Gordon. And then Gordon's ghost saw his actual body fall out of a cupboard before the house exploded. So now we know that the monk was bringing the body of Gordon back to where it belonged, because he had maps in his car from being at the service station when he stopped.
Right, right.
But I like that the monk felt that he had been rewarded, because the horse that he had missed was just brought and dropped off at the field that his tree was in. And the horse was happy to finally have some freedom and wandered to stand underneath the tree. And the monk dropped out of the tree onto his back.
Oh, yep. I have notes that say there were a lot of thoughts from a horse.
Yes. Yes, it was reminiscent of the whale.
Yes, exactly. Oh, my gosh.
So chapter 18, Richard called Susan and got confirmation that Gordon has been murdered and that he is wanted for questioning by the police. Dirk urges him not to go to the police because, innocent or not, he looks guilty and all the events in his mind are jumbled up. So Dirk wants to hypnotize Richard so he can get the story from Richard under hypnosis, which should be the real story. Richard decided to turn himself in and walked to his apartment. When he got close and saw how it was surrounded by police, he quickly turned and pretended to read the menu in the window of a Greek restaurant.
And of course, he did have to bring up Retsina.
Yes, Retsina was definitely on the menu. So he eventually reluctantly decided to go back to Dirk's office, and on the way, out of the blue, he was approached and insulted by a boy who wanted his jacket. At Dirk's office, his secretary was back so that Dirk would notice she was gone. In Dirk's office, room was very dim, and on the desk was a bicycle lamp pointed at a metronome that had a silver spoon attached to it, going back and forth. And back at Richard's place, the police are still there and struggling with the couch on the stairway. One policeman pulls up in a car and tells the constable he just came from Gordon Way's house, and he complained about his car always being cold and the radio turning itself on and off. So Gordon hitched a ride with the police. Chapter 19. Michael Wenton Weeks has been having dreams involving mud and slimy things. He also had them with the feeling of undoing what has been done. Michael makes his way upstairs to his workroom and actually listens to music for the first time, rather than just hearing it. He tapes together the issue of Fathom that he tore up and threw away, and paged through it until he arrived at and read Richard's article, Music and Fractal Landscapes. While reading this article, he thought of his dream of slimy things. He thought about Coleridge. He pulled The Rime of the Ancient Mariner off his shelf and read it. It was familiar, but stirred memories that were not his. Feelings of loss and desolation were so profound, he could do nothing but surrender to them.
After Wenton Weeks pulls together the magazine, he does go and read the article that was written by Richard.
Right.
And what I thought was fascinating, and I'm sure you picked up on this immediately, after having read Salmon of the Doubt, this is the article that he wrote.
Right.
So Richard is, in this portrayal, Douglas Adams.
Yes, he is.
So this particular belief and his understanding of, in the article that Douglas actually wrote, it was Bach.
Right.
But as we find out later, it's not Bach here in this particular story. But I found it interesting that he referenced his own article in this book as being
Yes.
an incredible piece of literature.
Right. Yeah. He's his biggest fan.
Mm-hmm. So even in Douglas Adams' article, he comes back and references the complex nature of music and its relationship to numbers. And here in the book, he says all these things can be described by a complex flow of numbers. That's not a reduction of it, he says. That's the beauty of it. Ask Newton, ask Einstein, ask the poet Keats, who said that what the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth.
Right.
And I thought that was fabulous.
Mm-hmm. So chapter 20, we are back in Dirk's office, and Richard awakens from Dirk's hypnosis. To help Richard revive, Dirk suggested a quick stroll along the canal. So Dirk explained that of everything he learned about Richard's events of the previous night, only 2 were impossible. Then he changed to inexplicable because you cannot call something that happened impossible. And Dirk refers to Reg's conjuring trick with the salt cellar and the 200-year-old vase. He wants to ask Reg a few questions, but he does not like asking questions of which he does not already know the answers. The second impossible thing is Richard's sofa being stuck. Dirk believes these 2 events are connected because of Richard's being a suspect in a highly suspicious murder and his recent erratic behavior. So Richard was telling Dirk that his climbing the wall to get into Susan's apartment to retrieve the answering message was perfectly reasonable. Dirk wanted to tell him what the old maiden aunt from Winnipeg used to say, and Richard took off all his clothes and jumped into the canal because it just occurred to him that he did not have his morning swim.
Mm-hmm. And as they're preparing to leave, he says, "Let us prepare to grapple with the ineffable and see if we may not F it after all."
Right. The ineffable will of Bob.
Here's Bob.
After his swim, Richard was handed a towel, and he asked Dirk if he always carried a towel around with him. Richard also claimed that his actions were perfectly reasonable. Dirk and Richard sat on a bench, and Dirk played a recording of the hypnosis session where he gave Richard a post-hypnotic suggestion to jump into the canal at the mention of his old maiden aunt. Dirk wants to find out what possessed Richard to climb the wall and steal the tape of the previous night. So I think that a hypnosis session is a wonderful way for Dirk to find out more about Richard's evening than Richard consciously knows.
Correct.
There are too many stories I have heard that have one character tell another character everything that happened. And when I read this, I keep screaming, we already know this. It's like the same scene just keeps getting repeated and repeated. Here, he just puts him under hypnosis, and then we come back and he already knows even more than Richard knows.
Exactly. I mean, even more than Richard knows he knows.
Right. Chapter 21. Dirk gets into Richard's apartment by bamboozling the police. He was confronted by Sergeant Gilks and told him Richard was his client. Dirk pocketed the cassette tape from Susan's machine when Gilks turned around. Sergeant Gilks caught him doing it and made Dirk play the tape. After Gordon was shot on the tape, Gilks had Dirk stop the tape, and he was able to calculate the exact time of death. Gilks left the room, and Dirk continued to listen to the tape. He was listening for something. He did not know what he was listening for, and the realization he was listening for something and he didn't know what it was too familiar and gave him chills. He admonished the entity, and it withdrew from him.
Right. The ghost was trying to possess him at this point. The ghost of Way, that is.
Yeah, Gordon's ghost was trying to possess him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then the voice of the ghost of Gordon quietly played on the tape. Dirk stopped it, rewound it a little bit, and erased the tape from the point just before the ghost spoke.
Right.
So all of Richard's message is also gone. So Dirk turned on Richard's answering machine, and then he saw the phone receiver fall off the cradle and the dial start to turn. An attempt to dial happened a few times, and then the entity seemed to get frustrated.
Poor Gordon Way.
Yeah. At this point, there's a poltergeist scene with a fit of ghostly rage where objects flew around the room. I felt it was a bit much because Gilks appeared in the doorway and seemed to witness this spectacle and then retreated and then came in again and pretended that it didn't happen.
Yeah, and so did we. Oh, my goodness.
And they made it seem that Gordon's ghost was trying to call the recently turned on answering machine in Richard's workroom so he could communicate with Dirk.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't call your own answering machine.
Right.
So he would just gotten a busy signal.
Right, or the only thing that we do know is that throughout the next few chapters, Gordon is trying to call Susan. So maybe he was, in fact, trying to call Susan.
Oh, that could be. He could be trying to call Susan. But it happens right after Dirk turns on the answering machine.
You're right. You're right.
So we meet back up with Michael, and it says that his mind is melded perfectly with another's. He now has a purpose. In 22, Richard called Susan from a public payphone, so the call would not be traced to where he could be found. And Susan invited him over, and he went. Chapter 23. So this is an interesting chapter. We really get to learn here about Dirk and his unorthodox methods. Like he mentioned before about the conjuring trick, he needed to ask Reg some questions, but he needed to know the answers first. The only way to solve some of the imponderable questions is to take your mind off that problem and onto another. So Dirk made some illegible squiggles on a piece of paper and called it the answer. Now, his new problem was to figure out what language it was written in. I'm like, well, I get the joke, but that's not really how it works. So he asked his secretary what she thought, and she told him it was childish. He said it had to be because only a childlike mind clear of filters could solve the problem. So she told him to ask a child.
Right. And I do specifically like this particular part of the book. If I could repeat it, it'd be great. Only a child sees things with perfect clarity because it hasn't developed all those filters which prevent us from seeing things we don't expect to see. So where does this sound like to you? It's someone else's problem.
That's right. It's an SEP.
It's an SEP, buddy. Never let it be said that he doesn't use it.
Right. Chapter 24. Richard is at Susan's, and they are trying to get grips on what has happened and the death of her brother, Gordon. The phone rang, Richard answered it, and there seemed to be nobody on the line. Susan said that happened a few times that day. A few moments later, Dirk arrived at Susan's apartment. And the electric monk is searching for money. He goes back to the filling station where he climbed into Gordon's trunk, and he gets arrested.
So, this goes back to the scene where we were talking about the policeman trying to determine whether or not the worker at the gas station or the filling station would be able to determine what was crazy.
Right.
And we're told in the description of the monk arriving at the filling station, so the monk dismounts his horse and he walks towards the small shop building and saw that inside there's a man with his back towards him, wearing a dark uniform and peaked cap. The man was dancing up and down, twisting his fingers in his ears,
right.
And he was clearly making a deep impression on the man standing by the till. So once again, the cop is putting his fingers in his ears and making funny faces.
Well, this is one of those things that makes this book confusing to me is the timeline.
Right.
Like this scene that the monk is experiencing, which is sandwiched between two things that happened long after what the monk is experiencing.
Well, it does appear that way, but where the timeline gets a little skewed is we get the description of the cop interviewing the worker at the gas station.
Right.
Before we get the information that the cop knows that Gordon Way's been killed.
Right.
But obviously he has, so the event of the cop is out of time with the description in the book. So the cop's description of interviewing is happening now in chapter 24.
Right.
Because Gordon Way's been killed and now he's out interviewing people, and then all of a sudden the monk shows up on his horse
Yes.
at the gas station.
And I know that if you're telling a story from multiple perspectives and everything's happening at the same time, you can't tell it all at the same time. But you kind of get lost as to when did this happen versus this happen when you've got the same scene being played out many chapters apart.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about this chapter is another piece of the puzzle is being revealed, where we learn that Dirk is curious to find out what the first question that King George asked the Regis to answer.
Right.
Remember, we were told in the dinner the second and third, as it turns out.
Right.
But we were not, in fact, told what the first question is.
Correct.
And Dirk is now curious, what was the first question?
Mm-hmm.
And that happens here in chapter 24. So, boy, you just have to be on your game to follow all these details.
Yeah, you need to take notes. Dirk explained that he figured out the conjuring trick, and he cannot tell Richard what it is because it would not be believed. He had to show him. So he and Richard need to go to Cambridge because he uncovered the biggest secret on the planet. So in chapter 25, Dirk and Richard arrive at St. Sed's in Cambridge, and they're there to see Reg. And they meet up with the security guard that Richard asked about a horse. Dirk immediately called him by his correct name, which is Bill, and on the way to Reg's rooms, Dirk talks of the many accomplishments that have come out of St. Sed's, the most impressive being the cat flap.
I love that. Isaac Newton's invention of the cat flap.
Right. And he talks about obvious inventions, and I will agree that I am always impressed with a new, completely obvious invention. And I've been guilty, and I am sure we've all been guilty of saying, I could have invented that, but you didn't.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, here's another obvious thing that happens. We understand now that Chronotis is a time traveler.
Yes. So, at Reg's, Dirk was quickly recognized and warmly greeted by Reg. And Richard was surprised that Dirk knew him so well. So Dirk told Richard that they had met only once at dinner, but they hit it off well and had a close rapport. Richard wanted to know why he and Reg never saw each other again, and Dirk said Reg avoided him because it's dangerous to have close rapport with someone when you have the biggest secret in the world. Dirk helped Richard discover the secret by having him ask Reg how he did the conjuring trick, embedding the salt cellar into an old pot. It was revealed that Reg has a time machine and that it is the room in his residence.
So Dirk is interrogating Reg, and Dirk is asking Reg, what were the questions that George III asked of him? Because Dirk knows of two of the questions, but he doesn't actually know what the first question is. So he's asking him here. He says, he asked you, continued Dirk, consulting a small notebook he pulled from his pocket, if there was any particular reason why one thing happened after another, and if there was any way of stopping it. Did he not ask you, and ask you first, if it was possible to move backwards in time, or something of that kind? And this is where Reg acknowledges that is in fact what it was.
Right. In chapter 26, Michael Wenton Weeks found himself on a train car surrounded by a wedding party that just wanted to get drunk. He grabbed the arm of one of the guests and, not as himself, began the story of how he was on a ship. Ages ago he came here with other believers to turn this place into a paradise of art and music. Oh, so here it is actually revealed that he's come to colonize.
Yes, that's true. Here's a couple pieces of the puzzle coming together. And I guess it's important at this point to, if we're going to get to the end of the chapters, which we will.
Yes.
Here shortly, that we sort of introduce this character that we've been alluding to, but haven't really been introduced to.
Yes, so let's talk about him right now.
Right. And that would be the other ghost in the story. I think we mentioned it before, but...
And we'll mention him again. Yeah.
Yes. In order to conclude the book, we kind of have to pick him up here because I think it's important that we understand Wenton Weeks' motivation from this point on.
Right.
He is, in fact, being possessed by a ghost that's been on the earth for millions and millions of years.
Right.
And it's the motivation of this ghost that has driven the story forward, and we haven't seen it, except in odd little comments about not feeling like themselves or doing actions that seem odd to them, etc. And Dirk, of course, has understood that there's some other motivation out there that none of the actors have been able to understand, and he's come to realize that there's something going on here. And what's interesting about this particular part of the story, which I only wrote 2 words, and that's Wenton Weeks,
right,
tells the story of the ship, which in fact is a spaceship that lands on the Earth, and he mesmerizes one of the partygoers to the point where the guy gets lost in thought.
Right.
And almost gets abandoned by his troop of partiers.
Right. Chapter 27. Reg explained that he is very old and his memory is very poor. He does not even remember who he is or what he used to do. What he does remember are smells and earrings. And that is why Cleopatra stands out so prominently in his mind. The time machine is very simple to use and is somehow linked to his abacus.
Right. He refers to his abacus as the control unit.
Right.
And this is where, again, there's a bit of credulity that has to be stretched. We are told that the abacus is actually just the front-facing part of a very powerful computer. So powerful that it includes all the processing speed of every computer everywhere, including itself. So we've either been introduced to Hacktar or Deep Thought. One of these two, but we don't know which.
Or the one that was... Deep Thought was compared to something like the Gargantua brain.
Yes.
He called it a mere abacus.
Exactly. There you go.
So
maybe
this
it
could
is
be
the
that
Gargantua
computer.
Brain. Uh-huh. We found the origin of the Gargantua brain.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, isn't that fun?
So they did a joke here about how difficult it is to program a VCR back in the day. Mm-hmm. And it was easier for Reg just to go back in time and watch the program when it aired if he missed it, rather than trying to program his VCR to record it.
Right, and Richard is appalled that he would use a time machine just to watch TV.
Right. But Reg explains that, though tempted, he's got a very strict rule about changing anything in the past.
Right, and this is critical, because as we'll learn going forward, that decision, that position he has, is another reason why the rest of the story unfolds.
Right. So Richard reminded him that he broke that rule last night, and Reg said that he went back in time and found the man who made the pot and made him bake the salt cellar into it so he could brighten the evening of the little girl who was having a bad time at the dinner. And Richard asked Reg if his actions could be deemed a little disproportionate. Because Richard finally is now realizing that his actions of climbing up the wall to erase an answering machine message was a bit disproportionate.
Mm-hmm.
So something is controlling all these people and making them do disproportionate things, but giving them perfectly reasonable sounding reasons for doing it.
Right.
So the train stopped in Cambridge and Michael Wenton Weeks disembarked carrying a large bag.
Isn't that ominous?
Yes.
It was very ominous in the
What is in this bag? You're thinking,
Uh-huh.
What is in this bag? And then you finally find out, and it's kind of funny.
Yep.
So the wedding guest he cornered told his friends an odd story of how Michael said he was once on a ship. A mistake happened. There was an explosion. He caused it by trying to put it right and killed everybody. Then there was slimy things with legs. And the part about the bird was all wrong, but it would be put right.
Yeah, that was the albatross, right?
Yes.
And oh gosh, we'll get to that.
Chapter 28. Reg told Dirk and Richard that the dull but odd time he has been having lately is because he felt an outside force trying to get him to use the time machine to do something he wanted to do but swore off. When he fought the urge successfully, things started to fly around the room. So this other ghost has the same temper tantrum that Gordon has.
Exactly. And the important part is in the discussion of the ghost and possession that the ghost is able to possess an individual and get them to do things that they would normally want to do,
Right.
or something within the range of what they are willing to do.
Correct.
But beyond that, he has no control once they are possessed.
Right. So during this conversation, he mentioned the horse and how it must have wandered in when he went to get face powder on a planet in the Pleiades. So here in chapter 28 is the guy that was putting dust on himself all the way back in chapter 2.
Yes, absolutely. I think about these books and I think about these authors, and I'm thinking to myself, man, this would have been one of those perfect, crime boards with the lines going from here to there and back and forth and around the corner. I mean, if you charted this out, you'd have one of Richard's musical compositions, I think.
So Richard was astonished that he would go all the way to a distant planet for face powder, and he said it was no distance at all in the space-time continuum.
And it was the perfect shade of pink.
Yeah. And it was a lot less far than the chemist's.
Mm-hmm.
So you might think it's a long way to the chemist, but that's just peanuts to space.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, we have to talk about that too a little bit anyway.
Reg concluded that while he fought the urge to do one thing, it was easy for the ghost to get him to do the other. He said the ghost left him right when he got back. Dirk implied it went then into Richard. So the ghost went from the professor into Richard at the dinner.
At the dinner, right.
Yes. Richard said he thought Dirk said he was under post-hypnotic suggestion, and Dirk said that he put Richard under hypnosis to prove to Richard that a person being controlled by hypnosis or possessed by a ghost will come up with their own seemingly rational reasons to do what they are being instructed to do. However, they will not be able to be forced to do anything too far outside their nature, and that is why Richard replaced the cassette tape at the last moment.
Mm-hmm.
Dirk asked Reg to tell him what it was that he wanted to do but swore off, and Reg said he would show him. And Michael went in weeks arrives on the campus, and the ghost that possesses him has gone mad. 29.
Mm-hmm.
Reg, Dirk, and Richard open the door and enter a rainforest where it was raining. Hence the name.
Yes, and guess where we come back to? It's our rain god. More lists of rain types.
So Reg brought them to Mauritius in 1676 to see a dodo.
Mm-hmm.
At this time, there were only 3 left, and it will be extinct within 4 years. And he only comes to look.
Mm-hmm.
Michael went in weeks, makes his way to Reg's. The mad ghost possessing him is happy he has found the perfect carrier. He thought the professor would work, but he fought. So he thought of getting a monk.
Right. The old ghost first tries to possess Reg when he figures out that Reg has this time machine.
Right.
And Reg resists and resists, and it's about his innate desire not to change the past that he keeps working away at him, needling away at him to find a way to get someone who will do what he wants. So when Reg finally goes to the planet with the pink sand, he knows that he has gotten him to get the monk that he thought he needed in order to do what he wanted to do.
The ghost made Reg use his time machine to do something that would make him need to go to that planet to get face powder so he could make a monk walk in.
Right. We're talking about the flow of the possession of the ghost. And
Right.
the ghost, as we find out through the rest of the story, is from Salaxalon. And the Salaxalonians, which we know sounds familiar,
Yes.
are the ones who are responsible for creating the electric monks.
Right.
And at some point, since the ghost determines that he isn't going to be able to get Reg to do what he wants, what he decides is while he's in possession of Reg, he will get Reg to go to Salaxalon to get him a monk that will then do as he wants on Earth. But as it turns out, of course, he ends up getting a defective monk that isn't capable of keeping a thought in his head for more than a few seconds, and that complicates the problem. The monk, of course, does show up on the horse in the bathroom and then goes on his merry way to kill Wei.
Right. Yeah.
The other interesting thing, of course, is another reference to Hitchhikers, is that he talks about how the time machine functions with the use of unreal numbers.
Right. Right.
Again, it's always those unreal numbers that come right back around in Douglas Adams' story. But I always think it's kind of funny because, to me, when you're dealing with an irrational number or an unreal number, you're really dealing more with a circle.
Yes.
It's not going to get you in any direction because you're only going to turn right back around to where you were.
Right.
But that's just my opinion.
Right.
And I do have an opinion about this particular time travel method, and we'll get into that here in just a few moments.
Okay. So, chapter 30. Dirk told Reg and Richard that the ghost would return. He said one form of ghost is somebody who died with unfinished business. Therefore, a time machine would come in very handy to go back and right the wrong that happened to free the ghost. Immediately after Dirk worked out that the ghost most probably now possesses Michael Wenton Weeks, and they would not have long to wait, Michael knocked on the door, entered, and put down his bag of scuba diving equipment.
Oh, and at first we're like, what?
Yeah. So Susan is on the phone with a friend talking about practicing her cello. It's a piece by Mozart with an annoying E-flat put in just to annoy cellists. After the call, the phone rings, and again there seems to be nothing on the line. She hangs up. Not wanting to be disturbed again, she thought about the answering machine that she mostly used for Gordon, and it made her sad. But since Richard might need her, she reluctantly turned it on. Gordon had been in Dirk's office using the phone to call Susan. Dirk's secretary left the office the first time she saw the phone seem to use itself. Gordon gave up and went for a walk on the canal, which was a trick that palled very quickly, so he went back to the street again. So that's another just thrown in their line. A walk on the canal sounds normal, but what she's really doing is walking on the water, and then he got bored with it, so he went back to the sidewalk.
Since he couldn't hover. He had to do something. Oh my gosh.
Gordon decided that it might be nice to go to the cinema. On the way, he heard a scream of horror, and a woman ran out of a door, wild-eyed and howling. 31. After Dirk got confirmation that Michael was willing to host the ghost, Dirk interrogated the ghost, and the ghost told his story. Richard said it sounded a lot like the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. The ghost said he had told his story to Coleridge, but it got garbled. The ghost told his story to them. He was one of 9 dozen on a spaceship that left their world to find a suitable new one. They landed on this planet to replenish some essential minerals. The ship was damaged entering the atmosphere. The ghost was in charge of making sure the ship was safe to take off. Rather than doing the work for himself and not wanting to know that it might not be safe, just reassured that it was, he sent out an electric monk. Any notes on 31?
Yes.
Okay.
It's actually in 31 that we learn a little bit about the poem, the Ancient Mariner poem, where the author is said to have been on laudanum at the time that he wrote it.
Okay.
There's more about that? later.
Yes.
Teaser. If you're still here, God,
Right.
give us.
Chapter 32. Gordon went back to Dirk's office and called Susan again and got her answering machine. The ghost in Michael explained that everyone on the crew was in the landing party. None are left. The main ship is still in orbit. After the accident, the ghost was all alone for 4 billion years. And only recently had life evolved and eventually humans. He wants to go back and fix the ship correctly so the ship never explodes and his torment will be over.
Okay, so here is where they talk about paradoxes.
Mm-hmm.
And Richard interrogates Reg a little bit about his thoughts on paradoxes.
Right.
And he's worried that if we were to do something, it's like the butterfly effect, won't everything go nuts? Mm-hmm. And don't we generate all kinds of paradoxes? And Reg stirs himself from thought. He says, no worse than many that exist already. If the universe came to an end every time there was some uncertainty about what had happened in it, it would never have gotten beyond the first picosecond.
Right.
And many, of course, don't. It's like a human body, you see. A few cuts and bruises here and there don't hurt it. Not even major surgery if it's done properly. Mm-hmm. Paradoxes are just scar tissue. Time and space heal themselves up around them, and people simply remember a version of events which makes as much sense as they require it to make.
Right.
So that's how they justify paradoxes within this particular book. And I say they, I mean Douglas Adams, I guess. But it is important to note that here.
Yes.
About their understanding of paradox.
Mm-hmm. So even though paradoxes are just scar tissue, Richard asked why Reg didn't try to save the dodo that he liked so much and kept going back to visit. And Reg said that the dodo went extinct because he tried to save the coelacanth. And he imposed the rule on himself because he couldn't take it anymore. And Reg thought they should help the ghost, and Dirk said he wants to see that ship in orbit.
You know what's funny, though? I was looking back here just as an auxiliary note. My copy of the book is a first American edition of the paperback. Okay. So it came out a year after the original book, like they used to do. Hardcover, right. And then a year later, the paperback came out. And I wondered back, and I don't really think it was. They found the coelacanth. It still exists today. So I don't think they knew that it existed in 1987, though.
Maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of this chapter, Gordon Way slowly pushed the receiver back onto its cradle. His last call finally finished. He vanished. Chapter 33. So Reg's time machine was able to take them to the ship. On it, there was music. Everything Richard speculated about mathematics, nature, and music were confirmed to him. He fainted. And he woke to the sound of a phone ringing. Mm-hmm. It was Susan. She asked where he was. He got out of bed and discovered he was still at Reg's. He went down to the main room to an unbelievable sight.
You know what I thought was funny about chapter 33? And I think this is interesting, and they don't actually say this, but it's my speculation, because they talk about the music that Richard hears when he enters into the ship, and Reg and Dirk are not really tuned into it at that moment, but then they become tuned into it and right. hear it. But what I think of, or what it made me think of, is that this was their actual memory core. This is the way that they stored information in the ship.
Right.
That the computer was actually connected to these waveforms of music. And so that when they were walking onto the ship, he was literally listening to the music of life.
Right.
The interconnectivity and the all-encompassing sound was just a representation of all of the digital data that was stored on the ship.
Right.
But I also thought of our friends because it does say the ship has been watching and listening and viewing and listening and watching.
Yes.
Guess who's there? It's the Grebulons!
It's the Grebulons.
They're orbiting the Earth.
Yes. So in chapter 34, through the door of Reg's room could be seen an ancient landscape with a lone dark tower that had a small red light deep within it. Michael was being helped put on the scuba gear so he could exit the room into the poisonous atmosphere to go to the tower. Dirk was agitated about the whole affair. As the ghost in Michael was about to leave to exit to right his wrong, Dirk asked if they would have to stay there and wait for the empty to be returned. So Michael turned, waved, and said goodbye. So Richard was told by Susan on the phone that the new editor of Fathom had been murdered, and that Susan was told by Gordon. That piece of information made it click to Dirk what the ghost's purpose was and why Michael was the perfect vessel. Dirk figured out that the ship was not leaving when it exploded, and they wanted to start life on this planet. So the ship exploding 4 billion years ago was the spark that started life on Earth. If it never explodes, everything they ever knew, including them, will have never existed. And Dirk said he needed to figure out a way to stop Michael, and they only had 2 minutes to do it. So chapter 35. Reg and Richard watch as Dirk goes to Coleridge's cottage and gets inside under the guise of conducting an interview. Reg said that Dirk was right, and all the instructions were in the piece once you knew what you were looking for. Reg said the ghost will always be around, and in fact, there will be 2 of them.
And Jeff, when I read this, I don't know how many, 20, well, actually it's 40 plus years ago now. I'm not even sure that I would have known this. And again, here's Douglas Adams at his sharpest. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I had to do some research to understand what he was talking about here.
Right. You shouldn't have to, though.
I mean, it's fascinating. So here is what we, as Americans, probably have no clue about, okay?
Okay.
And that is the poem Kubla Khan in 1816.
Right.
Written by Coleridge. And in fact, what is the story, the true story of what happened in real life, not in the book, but in real life, is that he had taken some drugs, fallen asleep, and woken up after a 3-hour nap, and had this poem in his mind. Every detail of this poem was within his mind, and he started writing. And he was writing furiously through this poem, and then all of a sudden, someone shows up at his house and interrupts him.
Right.
And after the interruption, he can only remember a few more words and a few more phrases, but nothing of the rest of the poem will come to him anymore.
Right.
So it's a poem lost in time. So he refers to it as a fragment of a dream.
Right.
And of course, we as Americans, our educational system would not have included information about this particular poem, probably, and certainly wouldn't have gotten to that much detail. So
about being drug-induced.
Yes, of being drug-induced, etc. Right. And in this book, in this chapter, the penultimate chapter, he says 2 words that make a difference, right? Mm-hmm. All the instructions were clearly contained in the piece once you knew what you were looking for. And what we haven't done here, because it's almost impossible to do, in fact, is throughout the book and at the early dinner party, they are reciting the poem, but the poem that they recite goes on and on and on. It's not the short version that we know in our history.
Right.
In their history, it's got much more information in there. And one of the lines that is repeated in the book a number of times is, and the creepy crawly things with legs slime came out of the slime, and I lived among them.
Right.
So that's the story of the ghost. The rest of the story that is then extracted by the interruption of Dirk.
Yes.
Interrupting Coolidge so that he doesn't write the rest of the story that Michael and Reg and Dirk have heard from the mind of Coleridge. So that is where these instructions were buried in that particular piece.
Yeah.
Without knowing that bit of history, without doing that little bit of research, it would be near impossible in my mind to get what's going on here. I mean, why did they go back in time just to interrupt a poet?
Right.
It doesn't seem logical until you understand that's the rest of the poem have the instructions of what they intend to do. Make this world their paradise.
Right. So when Dirk comes out of the cottage, he is convinced that he was able to muddle Coleridge's mind, and he will never remember the story that he was writing down. So it was Dirk.
Yeah, exactly. Dirk was the one who was able to go into him and interrupt his thought patterns.
Dirk did as Richard requested and asked Coleridge about the albatross, and that sparked an idea for a story. So Richard turned around, and all of a sudden, Reg had a beard. Richard asked what he had been up to, and Reg told him some adjustments, nothing drastic. Then Reg looked up into the sky and saw a flash of light.
Right, and again, here's an inference, and we're pretty sure this is accurate. We're going to say that the flash of light is Reg having destroyed the mothership above the Earth. They don't say that directly, but in the last chapter they do say, though, well, that's no longer a problem.
But in this day and age, we do not have a mothership orbiting our planet anymore. So
exactly. So it has been destroyed.
So if it was destroyed back in Coleridge's time, they would have never been able to notice a mothership up there.
Right. And of course, that was Coleridge wrote the Kubla Khan in 1816 during the reign of crazy George III.
Yes. So Reg dropped Richard off at his home on Friday evening, and Richard wanted to go back 3 weeks in time to make a reservation at the restaurant he wanted to take Susan to. So while they were 3 weeks in the past, Dirk opened the door so Richard's sofa could be delivered. And Richard arrives at Susan's apartment and hears her practicing. It is music he has heard before, but does not recognize it. He asks what it is and who wrote it. She told him it was Bach, and he was confused, having never heard of Bach or seen any of his extensive collection of sheet music. She made a quip which made him laugh after he realized the music was the same as in the ship. So before Reg destroyed the ship, he got as much music as he could, gave it to some schlub who became Bach.
Yeah, Joseph Sebastian Bach.
So Richard called Reg and was told that the monk and his horse are safely home. Richard asked about the music, and Reg took a tiny snippet of the music from the ship, more than any one man could compose in a lifetime, but figured nobody would look into it that seriously. And the ship is gone now, and the time machine is burnt out. It is dead as a dodo.
Here is the mystery solved for Richard's sofa. Richard is originally brought back to his house. In fact, right up to his stairs. So the door opens up onto the stairs. So the delivery people, while Richard is out making the phone call to make his reservation, come halfway up the stairs, knock on the door, turn the sofa through the door, go the other halfway up, and of course by then the door is gone again. So there is your sofa stuck in the hallway.
Impossibly, yes.
Because they use the fulcrum of the door to get it to where it actually ends up getting stuck.
Right. And the book ends with an old lady client of Dirk's phoning to complain about the bill he sent to her, because she does not know who he is or why he thinks her cat is missing. And Dirk began to explain about the interconnectedness of all things, and it is through his actions that the cat is no longer missing, or, more accurately, never went missing. But he gave up. And he revised her bill to read, "Saving human race from total extinction, no charge."
But then I love the part, though. He does go off and say he's going to send Richard a bill.
Yes. Yeah.
I can't even imagine what the expenses would be on that one.
No kidding.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, what a twisted tale. I'm telling you, without knowing that, I really got to the end of this book and had to reread that last paragraph 2 or 3 times before I understood what was going on here.
Right.
And I'm still amazed that this is the book that got one of his best lifelong friends, the archaeologist that he went through the Last Chance to See with.
Right. Mark Carradine.
Yes, Mark.
So was Reg Doctor Who?
Yeah. No. Well, that's the other funny thing, because I did write a note here because I wanted to point this out to you because I thought this would be interesting. George III, of course, was between 1760 and 1820.
Okay.
Which means that Reg was a man of a certain age, certainly at an age where he could have become a professor, maybe in his 30s, 20s, 30s,
right.
Sometime in the 1800s. So they don't quite explain how he could be living for as long as he has, even with a time machine, because it doesn't say that he doesn't age or isn't aging.
But Reg could have used the time machine to go back in time to get that professorship.
Actually, well, yeah, I suppose he could have. So in this book, and we've had many discussions, you and I, about the problems of time travel and the concept of time travel.
Mm-hmm.
And I've explained to you some of the things that I don't like about time travel stories and that kind of thing. But there's something here in this particular book that I kind of like. And that's the idea of the door.
Right.
Now, there are a couple of different authors that have written about doors, and a couple of great authors like Neil Gaiman has an incredible book, Neverwhere, that is a lot about traveling through space and time through doors. Okay. But what I like about this particular application of the time travel concept is that the door provides an anchor. And that's one of the things that allows me to accept the idea of paradox as they've explained it here.
Right.
Because the anchor of the other side of the door, they knowing that they can pass through the door and go back to their time frame, is always present in this story.
Right.
So it allows for the continuity of the timeline to continue to exist. Because in this particular application, when you look at the way they're time traveling, they're just phasing in and out of previous time, but anchored to their original time frame.
Right.
And so I really kind of like the idea of an anchor. And it's just interesting because with Reg going back and getting the music from the Music of Life on the ship and taking it to Bach. Now, Bach was alive between 1685 and 1750. So he goes back before King George III and takes the music back to Bach. And we don't know. I don't know. I mean, probably a lot of English people and people who studied in England may know about Bach and when he started writing, but I don't know exactly when he started writing.
Right.
But I thought that was a fascinating way to do that. And they're always anchored by that door into their reality, which has a nice symmetry to it that I can kind of enjoy.
Here's a real odd question that I don't think the answer is overly important. But Reg and Richard were waiting for Dirk to talk to Coleridge.
Mm-hmm.
And Reg snuck out, destroyed the ship, got the music, gave it to Bach, and came back at that moment. So it was like all of a sudden he's got a beard. So how long did it take It took a while.
Oh yeah, it took months or longer for all of that to occur for Reg. And that's the other part of this story that we just discussed a little while ago. Reg is immortal. I mean,
I don't think he is.
You don't think he is?
I don't think he is. I think he's a regular person who goes back in time and has... I don't know how you could be... What he was given the professorship or whatever.
Yes, he became Regis.
Right. What I don't know is how you become Regis back then and then go away for hundreds of years and retain the position. So they make it to where he has to be immortal, but I don't know why he's immortal, how he became immortal, if he's even an Earthling.
Yeah, is a question, isn't it? That is a really valid question, because the story of the abacus,
right?
If that's the calculating device that he used, it kind of falls along the frame of I would assume the early 1900s. Even before probab's.
Well, abacus goes back to Greece, right? I mean,
right.
This is
or
ancient
or China
Greece.
Or something,
Yeah.
It's an ancient device, and it precedes the slide rule, I guess, is the next piece of equipment that would be a multiplier of types. But how did it get connected to a computer, and when? We're not going to know that answer,
right?
And it's sufficiently vague in the telling that we'll just have to accept it. I think we know that it was the Celestic armor fiends of Striderax,
right,
and Hactar that chose a different form and possessed an abacus.
Yes.
Although he didn't ever travel in time, which I'm sure he would have appreciated being able to do if he could have. Okay, Jeff, I think we've beaten this horse.
Yeah. Yes, we have.
Oh my goodness! Overall, I think it's an exciting book. I really enjoyed reading it. Again, I know that I picked up a lot more information this time than I did originally.
Absolutely.
And Douglas has not let us down in this book.
No.
But what are we doing next, Jeff?
Well, I think we should maybe do a book that has a part with a girl being stalked by a Norse god.
Would that be a long, dark tea time of the soul?
That would be a long, dark tea time of the soul.
Yes, the next book in the Holistic Detective Agency series, right?
Absolutely.
Well, that sounds fantastic.
Yes. And now that we know what we're doing next time, I guess this is the end.
Oh, well, it was their research. It was their scout ship. The mothership was still circling the Earth. It was just a scout ship going down to test the water, and supposed to go down there, do some testing, come back up, and then tell them what's going on, and go back down, and come back up, and go back down. And
but the entire crew of the mothership was on the shuttle.
In the entire crew of the mothership?
Yes, there was nobody left on the mothership because they all came down.
Is that what it says? I didn't catch that.
There's not a B arc to my... Well, maybe there is. Maybe it is the B arc.
We're making all kinds of speculations, but I would assume that they went down to the planet to do some investigation, had to go back up to the mothership to get all their equipment, and land the mothership to populate the new Earth.
By reviving all of the people in stasis. They don't say that. I think that is... It makes sense to me now.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for listening to this. A new episode is released on the first Thursday of every month. A special thank you goes out to Luke, Max, Greg, and Tim Lesnick for arranging and performing our opening theme. Visit our website at digitalwatchesareaprettyneatidea.buzzsprout.com. While there, you can find links to all of my Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy inspired t-shirt designs. You can contact us via email at digitalwatchespodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook at digital watches are a pretty neat idea. You can message us on Twitter, or should I say X, at WatchesIdea, and our Instagram is WatchesIdea Podcast.
This has been a Froods for Thought production.